All right, friends, welcome to the April 24th edition of the OpenSSF's Tech Talks. My name's Krobe. I'm going to be your moderator for today. The topic today is, I think, very timely and topical. We're all going to learn from our amazing community presenters on how to use the open source project security baseline to better navigate standards and regulations. I get the next slide, please. So we'll be starting here right meow. If you have questions, there's a Zoom Q&A feature. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, go ahead and feed those in. And if you are asking about a particular topic or speaker, if you could kind of key that in. So as we go back to questions, it'll help me easily get that routed to the right person. We have a lot of ways to get a hold of us on the socials. We also have an amazing website, the openssf.org. Get involved is where you can learn all about our technical initiatives. This Tech Talk is being recorded and will be shared through our YouTube channel. And all the slides and recordings will be publicly available shortly after this session. Next slide, please. All right. So at the end of the session, please take a look at that little QR code and give us a survey to kind of tell us how we did, if this something was useful and valuable to you. We're going to talk about, introduce our speakers here shortly, and we're going to talk about framing the problem that we all face today. We're going to learn about this amazing project, the OSPS Baseline, and then we're going to talk about applying that baseline and all the broader concepts that the other speakers started off with, kind of tie it all together, what the OpenSSF is doing around this. Then we'll have time to have a little chitty chat between the panelists and for audience Q&A. So that's when we'll address your questions. And then at the end, we'll have some amazing announcements that'll change your life. So stay tuned to the end. Next slide, please. As with every meeting within the OpenSSF, we are bound by the antitrust policy and the Linux Foundation's Code of Conduct. So please be aware that this is a neutral location where professionals get together to share ideas. And please respect the antitrust and the codes of conduct. Next slide, please. There's my friend, the Code of Conduct. Great. As my friend Angela pointed out, with a little red box at the bottom of your Zoom is the Q&A feature. That's where we will be queuing up questions for the speakers as we proceed. Next slide. All right. My name's Krobe. I'm the least interesting person here. I'm the OpenSSF's chief security architect. I do security stuff. Next slide, please. Ben, could you give us a little TLDR about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Cotton. I am the open source community lead at Kusari, and I'm here today as the newly anointed lead of the baseline SIG in the OpenSSF, and was a maintainer and contributor to that project for at least the last half year or so, I think. So I'm excited to talk to you about that today.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is my friend Emily. You want to give your little introduction?
Sure thing. Hello, everyone. My name is Emily Fox. I am a member of the Technical Oversight Committee in CNCF, and I am a portfolio security architect at Red Hat. You've probably seen me show up in a bunch of different open source communities and foundations, and if we haven't had the pleasure, it is a wonderful opportunity to meet you all.
Thank you. And last, but certainly not least, my friend Megan. You want to give an introduction to yourself, please?
Oh, sure. Howdy, howdy. Thanks for having me today. My name's Megan, and I am the Director of Software Communities at ARM. And you may have seen me popping up in the new OpenSSF Cyber Policy Working Group in the awareness work stream within that, and we'll be talking more about that later today. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, panelists. So first off, Emily is going to frame the problem for us. So Emily, please take it away.
Of course. Well, everyone nowadays seems like they need to navigate some complex security standard and evolving regulation while addressing increasingly voluminous amounts of security vulnerabilities. This web of competing standards, nuanced controls, and lack of harmonization can make it difficult for even security professionals in an enterprise to understand how they can comply and even where to start. So why are we even talking about this in the context of open source projects? Do they even need to do this? Well, they don't, sort of. Historically, open source has been forgotten except by the engineers who use it. These aren't the same people that are concerned with compliance. This is changing largely because organizations have gotten a little better in protecting their infrastructure. Or have they? You see, the US government passed the Computer Fraud, Waste, and Abuse Act in 1986. It's one of the earliest forms of legislation in an attempt to regulate how individuals could lawfully interact with computers and therefore criminalizing unauthorized access. 2 years later, the Morris worm began exploiting several vulnerabilities across the internet, and it wasn't with malicious intent necessarily, it was just to see whether or not it could be done. And then in the late 80s and 90s, the Rainbow series was published, and it provided very early technical standards for securing systems. It's not a law, and it's not a regulation, but it was a step in establishing best practices. But of course, it was still voluntary if you could find it or make even sense of it. In subsequent years, as more individuals and organizations came online and became internet connected, more worms and hacks targeting institutions occurred. And as technology matured and developed, these worms and hacks became data breaches and attacks on infrastructure to exfiltrate sensitive data, often for businesses, but also for individuals, including their social security number and credit card information. And while these occurrences were first very slow, technology advancements allowed adversaries to exploit weaknesses far faster than security practices could be developed and improved, leaving organizations in a constant firefight mode. Security expertise was and continues to be limited, with organizations that are more security conscious defining their own security practices, occasionally advocating for those within industry to adopt so the overall risk is reduced. And while these practices eventually begin to saturate industry organizations, they're still reliant on individuals discovering them. Some of them are paywalled, and ensuring that engineers responsible for applying them actually understand the intent and the expectation behind them is tricky, but they have to do that in order to be able to apply them for a specific technology, like containers. And here's where we start to have a huge gap in knowledge. Security jargon is not the same as engineering jargon. Next slide. But all of this was voluntary, and scoped nearly exclusively to businesses who were driven by contracts and profitability. Security and profitability don't often coincide when user functionality is a concern. There are trade-offs, and for most organizations, profitability supersedes security hands down, especially when or if security is working right, you have no visible effects. But there are obvious exceptions. Some businesses see cybersecurity as a competitive advantage for reaching exclusive markets. But each business delivered cybersecurity outcomes differently, and that results in gaps within technology and across technologies, leaving consumers responsible for implementing them together, subject to attacks and breaches where those gaps between technologies exist. And historically, industry groups and public-private partnerships were a means to achieve cybersecurity and stay synchronized on the fundamentals of modern security. They're also not universally held across geopolitical environments. These groups often excluded the one software type industry began relying almost entirely upon, and that's open source. You see, open source is voluntary, it's transparent, it's globally distributed. None of the things that industry really is. And it does not have the same governance policies and requirements imposed upon it or by businesses. It falls into this other bucket of concern that we generally didn't really understand how to deal with. Open source is considered a universal common, or good that's used in accordance with its license, and the code is available for free within the terms of its license, so organizations can begin adopting it rapidly, and they did so without conducting due diligence or even applying their own cybersecurity practices they worked so hard on for at the time of consumption. This means that as new requirements are being imposed, either by a business itself or by new regulations coming out, businesses often transferred those requirements onto open source projects, who promptly told them, "That's not our problem, go fix it yourself," until open source adoption accelerated, and then the supply chain attacks began. Because organizations and businesses have made it slightly harder for attackers to get what they want by improving their overall security practices, attackers began looking upstream to this wonderful world of open source, realizing it's a lot less effort to hack with more impact than targeting one company after another. So we see more attacks and vulnerabilities in open source projects because people are paying more attention to them. What looked like a few vulnerabilities a couple of years ago, and today is a lot and seems like a really big problem, it's just an increase in the volume because we now know where to look and how to report. We've done a great job at finding problems, but not so great at preventing them in the first place. And we're back to this lack of consistent application and security best practices. But the problem is even bigger, and it's not just industry, it's also the open source it runs on. And this is where adoption of best practices is broken. Had we been consistent and applied them universally, governments wouldn't need to create cybersecurity regulations to protect their citizens. We made our bed, folks. Now we have to sleep in it. Next slide. And now we know more than we did 25 years ago. In the early days of supply chain attacks, we developed more robust and clear security practices built from very painful learnings of those attacks. However, they're still not adopted. Organizations still have security concerns. As discussed at the OpenSSF Policy Summit in DC earlier this year, many of these are related to open source and new technologies like artificial intelligence. But it's not just limited to these. We need more understanding and transparency to reason about all software so consumers can make informed risk decisions, whether or not it's an enterprise-grade commercial product or an open source project that's just really doing a great job. This applies not only to the software developed within the business itself and what they're consuming, but just in the general supply chain of software, all the way out through open source and its dependencies. This needs to be applicable across the globe and not piecemealed to each individual country. That's how we get back to having gaps and more problems and more attacks. Until now, where the European Union has actually stepped in to use its power as a consumer of technology to try something different and actually regulate this space. And at the same time, open source is taking the reins on harmonization and security practices with the open source project security baselines. Over to you, Ben.
Right. Thank you, Emily. Go ahead and move on to the next slide. So you may have heard of the Open Source Project Security Baseline or the OSPS Baseline, or some people even say OSPS. But what is it, right? So it's a set of security controls for project maintainers that with direct and actionable guidance across 8 categories and 3 levels with cross references to other frameworks. Hello, CRA. This is the last time I will read a slide to you verbatim, but whatever. So next slide, please. So the question is, why baseline? There are other, things out there, right? There's the NIST cybersecurity framework, there's the SSDF, there's OpenSSF scorecard, best practices badge, and all that. Well, these are all great things, but in the tradition of that wonderful XKCD comic, we had 15 standards, so we decided to have one that would encompass them all, and now we have 16 standards. But the motivation here was to give a very simplified, straightforward set of controls for maintainers to use in improving the security posture of their projects. What really got people excited is the idea that, oh, this could also help, ease CRA compliance, because if we know the software we're consuming conforms with a certain baseline level, which maps to CRA requirements, or the software we're producing is at a certain baseline level, then we have a lot more confidence in our ability to meet requirements. But then also there's the whole idea of improving the overall security posture of the ecosystem, right? A supply chain is a chain, and we all know that the weakest link in a chain is the strength of the chain. And so by improving everyone's, security posture, we improve our own and we improve everything that we care about. So many attacks, as Emily alluded to, happen from your dependencies and not a direct attack on the software you're producing. So the idea behind baseline is to be complementary to other efforts. Scorecard in particular, it's really awesome, but a lot of the real world feedback I've heard is that some consumer of software runs the scorecard checks, sees certain things that are missing, and goes to the maintainers and says, I demand that you do this to make the number go up. Um, so with Baseline, we really wanted to have something for the maintainers where they could just say, we meet this level. They don't need to provide a report card. They're certainly welcome to. And if, companies, kind of like a SOC 2 audit, right? Like you say, we meet, SOC 2 requirements. And if somebody really wants to see the full details, well, they can, make an arrangement with you for that. Next slide, please. So the idea here is, like the I propose a trade meme. Um, you know, Manufacturers get an easy way to validate their dependencies for compliance. And I use the word manufacturers here because that's a CRA term of art. Really, what we're talking about is any vendor who incorporates some open source code into their project or into their product, which is pretty much every vendor at this point. And maintainers receive easy improvements to their security posture without this obligation of, you must go do this, 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 right? Like as a project maintainer, I don't have to meet any baseline level if I don't choose to. I don't have to make any changes that I feel are inappropriate to my project. But if I want to participate, I can evaluate my project against the baseline, say this is the level I meet, and then people know what they can expect. So this also eliminates that whole demand for specific changes that may or may not be relevant to my project. Next slide, please. And so as I was actually working on the content for this presentation, I thought of some principles, and the rest of the maintainers agreed with them without like any edits, which was a little disturbing, actually. But the principles behind how the baseline is written and maintained focuses on these four attributes, right? It's focused. There's no should, there's only must. And this is in the RFC sense of the words, right? We want it to be like, this is the thing to do. Not you can do this and that and this and that. Like, if it's not a must, it doesn't belong in the baseline. There are plenty of other places to get good ideas for security posture. It also needs to be realistic. It would be cool if every project produced SBOMs and signed attestations and had VEX statements and did retrospectives for, every vulnerability that happened. Most projects, especially consider the long tail of like one or two developers working on something in their spare time every few days. That's not realistic. Like there's no point in having the baseline if maintainers aren't going to adopt it and use it. So it needs to be something that is reasonable for maintainers to actually do. And that's where the levels that I'll talk about come in. It needs to be actionable. Like we want to give specific guidance on what to do. So each control tells you like, do this. Now it's not like click here and then type this in because that doesn't scale to all the different combinations of tooling that people might use. But we don't want to be giving maintainers homework projects, right? Like it's not go out and research 10 different ways to implement this control and then write 3 paragraphs about each explaining the differences. No, it's hey, go do this. So each control has, basically kind of suggestions targeted at, the middle of the bell curve. And then, if you're doing a weird edge case, that's on you to figure out. But we really want to make this like straightforward, low burden to implement. And in kind of going back to the first one a little bit, like all the controls should make a real difference. They need to be meaningful. It's not, oh, well, it wouldn't hurt to add this, I guess, because everything we add is an additional burden on maintainers, right? So unless something's going to actually meaningfully improve the security posture of the project, let's not put it in there. I also, just in the interest of making a word, wanted to add like exciting to the end, but honestly, it should be boring. So sorry about that. It's just fram instead of frame. Next slide, please. So I talked about the levels, and the reason we have these levels is to try and scope it to, different size projects and to help make those controls reasonable, right? Um, So there's three levels right now. We've kind of discussed like maybe there's a fourth. There's no like magic number except for three is a really cool number, I guess. Um, but the first level is like the basest of baselines, right? So that's for basically any project with any number of maintainers or users. It's the kind of thing where if like I'm starting this one little project mostly for myself, but I might share it with some people, these are the sort of the basic things that I should be doing regardless. Um, the second level, level two, is for projects with two or more maintainers and a small number of consistent users. These aren't like the big, like, key projects that undergird the whole world, but they're, more than just sort of a toy project. They have some significant use. And so we have add a little more as people like actually start to depend on that. And then we have projects with a large number of consistent users, things like Kubernetes, the Linux kernel, the Firefox browser, these sorts of things where, millions or billions of devices are using it. Lots of people rely on it. It's in very critical infrastructure. Curl is on the moon and on Mars, for example. So we want to be able to, have like the highest level of scrutiny, I guess, for those kinds of projects. And those projects are typically slightly better resourced than, my little, side project that I do on weekends when I'm not out grocery shopping or whatever. Um, and so like they can also, take on some of that additional burden. A lot of times they're backed by foundations and things like that. If you want to condense these levels into like single words that maybe sound familiar to you, you might think of them as sandbox, incubating, and graduated. Don't know where I got those from, but those sound good. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the categories. We don't need to go into a lot of detail. There's a list here. There's eight of them, and it's basically just, a way to simplify kind of understanding the different scope areas. Um, there's nothing like magical about them. We just thought it would be useful. They could all just be, uncategorized, whatever. Um, One thing that may or may not happen in the future is, there's been some early conversations, got to rub AI on everything right now, right? So like, is there uh, space for an AI baseline that would probably include all of these eight things, but maybe there's an optional additional category. Maybe it's a fork with some other stuff bolted on. Who can say at this point? But again, like this is just kind of to help people conceptually understand what's going on. Next slide, please. So again, this is not like for you to sit there and read. It's a screenshot of the web page. It just shows, hey, here's the control, here's the description, what's the actual requirement, what do we recommend, what maturity levels does it apply to, and then as you can see on the screen, there are mappings to different controls like the CRA and things like that. So that's just kind of how we present it. Fun fact is when we first got it building on a website instead of just a markdown file in GitHub, it was basically a table because, we're all engineers and we just render things as tables. And some of the feedback I got when I had shared it on social media is like, hey, this is really hard to consume. And so we spent some time making it a little more navigable. There's even like a, go back to the top button on the website because you have to scroll a lot sometimes. Um, but the cool thing is the actual content is in a YAML file because everyone loves YAML. But that means it's, also machine parsable, so you can do other things with it. If you have tooling, which we'll talk about in a moment, or you have, something else that you want to do on top of it, it's not just some HTML that you have to sit there and scrape. Next slide, please. So, how does it work? We have, I mentioned, I'm the lead of the special interest group. We have a special interest group. We review pull requests. Um, we actually like do want pull requests. Again, like this is focused on being useful to people and used by maintainers. And so we've had a lot of feedback, even in the early stages of like, this wording doesn't make sense to me, or if I read this very strictly, it basically means I can't use Debian ever. Um, and so we're like, oh, okay, well, that's good to know. And so, it really is a open source project, lots of collaboration. I'm the one standing here presenting about it, but I've seen several people, in the attendee list who are active participants, including Eddie Knight, who really got the project started. So shout out to Eddie for that. Um, but we release, when there's significant changes that are necessary, new version by date. So it's really easy to reference, whatever it is, whatever version that you've evaluated against. Next slide, please. So, yeah, how do you apply it to your project? Well, like I said, you don't want to produce a report card, right? So you evaluate your repository and your built assets against the controls, and you say, this project meets the baseline level, blah, version blah, as of blah. Cool. Next slide, please. But like, how do you actually do that? And that's a great question. Tooling is in the works. There are a couple early projects that I mentioned here, Darn and Darn It, as well as a Privateer plugin. These are both sort of actively being developed as a way to automate the checking of the repos. Right now, maybe the main way is to uh, just go through and make a list and like, yep, we do that. We want actual like tooling available because that's going to be a lot easier for people. And then you can also run it regularly, and so if you've slipped up somewhere, you can fix it. Um, And to that end, there is a new working group. And by new, I mean, I think it was approved by the TAC last week, maybe 2 weeks ago at this point. So like it's still very much getting spun up. There's not a lot of structure in place yet. But the Orbit working group will be coordinating standards and tooling for security relevant data. So baseline will be under that working group, as well as some of these tooling projects will probably end up in there as well, or perhaps some other tooling. But the idea is to have, a collaborative ecosystem of interoperable tools for that. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it over to Megan to let you know how to get started and get involved.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you, Emily. We have now learned about the problem and how the baseline is really a great solution and part of a way to kind of solve this problem. So, what can we do now? What can we do today? So, first step, let's learn more about the baseline. We are going to share this presentation, and all of the links will be included in that. The link is just to the baseline website and to the GitHub for you to dig in on that. Yep. Okay, great. And then ideally, we'd love to see you all adopt it. Rolling these out across your projects, rolling this out internally, and then hopefully, next step, please. We'd love to see you give us some feedback. Complaints and compliments. We've got a Slack channel running on this here on the OpenSSF Slack, and we would love to get feedback on how the adoption's been going. If you've got any ideas for improvements or for iterations, that would move us to our last step, ideally, and hopefully you contribute those, whether it's through ideas or reporting bugs or anything of the sort. We would love to have your involvement in the baseline directly, and also through some of those working groups that we're talking about, the Global Cyber Policy Working Group and the Best Practices for Open Source Developers Working Groups. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where I put in the shameless plug for that global cyber policy working group that we just keep talking about. We, as an OpenSSF, held a workshop in last December, where we started to really dig into the meat of the CRA, both from the perspective of the manufacturer and from the perspective of open source stewards. And from that, we really identified these three key areas of kind of greatest community need, and also these same areas where we felt that we could really make a big impact. So we decided to kind of create these three work streams to divide and conquer on this massive body of work. So the first one is focused on those cybersecurity specifications, right? Developing community-driven standards, ensuring open source projects can actually meet these new security requirements that are outlined in the CRA. The baseline, cough, cough here. The next group was identified was tooling. So developing tooling and processes and best practices for regulation compliance, and really making these tools work for maintainers and manufacturers and maybe enterprise developers and everybody in between, because more often than not, the Venn diagram of roles overlaps significantly these days, right? And why would you want to have to use a different tool based on what role you're in? And then the third stream is this awareness stream, right? Building awareness and creating open source community focused resources to really help take this 300 plus page document and really break it down in a way that no matter if you are a developer or a compliance officer or someone working in standards and specifications, or you're an engineering manager or you work in the OSPO, you can digest what your role is in this and how you can succeed in, getting yourself ready for 2027. So, next slide, please. Okay, so one of the first things that we did when we started the awareness workstream was a study. We put out a big survey through LF Research that we wanted to kind of set a baseline, no pun intended, of understanding so that we could kind of dissect the areas that we needed to educate the community on the most, right? Where would we make that biggest impact? And in that research, we saw in this tiny little box that 62% of people surveyed said they were either not familiar at all or only slightly familiar with the CRA. This survey went out at the beginning of this year, so that's pretty alarming given that product life cycles are going to have changes that need to be implemented now in order to make that 2027 deadline. So that gave us a lot of work to do. So next click, Angela. Yep, so we've got lots of amazing and fun, cool statistics like that one that will both alarm you and excite you in that research paper, which seamless plug. Next slide, please. You can access here, whether you just want to go to the LF Research webpage directly or the links to the reports will be included below. The fun stats and more I gave you, you can find in the first research paper linked here, Unaware and Uncertain. Very daunting name. And then further expanding into ways that we can help organizations get ready for the CRA is this Pathways to Cybersecurity Best Practices in Open Source, the second research paper featured here. And this actually does demonstrate how other Linux Foundation projects like OpenSSF, Yocto project, Zephyr project, and Civil Infrastructure Platform are kind of already ahead of the ball on what is needed as far as CRA compliance and security measures go. So I'd encourage you to check that out as well to help further support your research. Next slide, Angela. Okay, so again, 300 pages. It is dull, but so important. If you don't have to read it, maybe don't. But if you would like to feel like you did, take this course. It's free, it's new, and you can do it in under 90 minutes if you are a fast reader slash comprehender. It is meaty. And the slides are yours once you take the course, and it covers a lot of really interesting topics like those key requirements we keep talking about. A lot of that terminology we keep saying that really hasn't popped up in our world before, and in defining what that is. What is a steward? What is a manufacturer? What am I? I don't know. Hopefully you'll know after taking this course. There's a lot of compliance strategies in there, and then how to navigate the uncertainties of the law. Now, here's to say this course does not have everything. For those that are more directly involved in the policy work, you know that the standards are still in the process of being developed. There's both horizontal and vertical standards that are still being developed, which means that we don't have all the answers yet. But we hope to continue up these education courses as those standards start to get rolled out so that we can help feed you the information you need and keep the blinders on for all the information that maybe is just overwhelming and not helpful. Next slide. Okay, so I've just given you a lot of information on ways that you can get involved. If you're interested, there is the repo for the Cyber Policy Work Group GitHub there. We are on Slack. We love a good GIF. Hop on in and tell us what's been going on for you. We've got a mailing list, and we also have those three groups that I mentioned, the awareness stream, the tooling stream, and then the standardization stream. They all have their own mailing lists. And we also have our own calls scheduled. They're bi-weekly, and the call schedule and links to those are all available on the GitHub link, the top link on this slide. Thank you so much.
Wow. I am so happy we had our community friends share this kind of origin story, what we're doing to address it, and then kind of share some information on how you can get involved today. So I would encourage folks to use the Q&A feature of Zoom if you have questions. We can get those addressed as we have time. It looks like Ben wants to answer one question right off the bat, and then I will kind of layer in other questions.
Yeah, so an anonymous attendee who I'm sure isn't Krobe asked, why is Krobe actually the most interesting person here? And I just want to point out that of the four of us, Krobe is the only one bold enough to put a goose on his head.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. But on a more serious note, let me address a question to my friend Emily first. And while everyone's furiously keying in their questions and answers, Emily, from your perspective, you talked about this history of cybersecurity frameworks and legislation. How have you seen these regulations impact upstream developers and upstream communities as you've been participating in both?
Most of the impact is actually negligible. Most open source project maintainers and contributors that I talk to about things associated with security just generally don't pay attention. And they're not always paying attention specifically to what compliance or regulatory framework has what security controls and whether or not their project should or should not be doing any of those things because it's a step removed beyond them. So, legislation like the CRA is kind of like their first foray into this space, and it's kind of terrifying because we're shifting this arbitrary concept of compliance into an environment where most maintainers just will run away screaming, probably rightfully so. But the reality is that they're responsible and not on purpose for a lot of the functional security capabilities that exist in all modern technology. If you think about the Linux kernel itself and all the security capabilities that it provides, operating systems and other technology built on top of it, it's pretty fundamental. If any of those things were to be compromised or changed, we're not in a good place as an industry. So they're still struggling to try to make sense of legalese to complianceese to engineering language. And it's important for security professionals at organizations, enterprises, or even students at universities that are becoming more familiar with this to get involved and get engaged and help break down some of that complexity and translation so that maintainers understand the point of it, understand how they could potentially do this in a way that's meaningful, and also what are the benefits to them in doing this and reducing their overall complexity and security and vulnerability management for their own projects.
Thank you. Excellent answer. Let us go to my internet friend Matt says, do you envision subgroups forming within these groups? And I imagine he's speaking about Orbit. So for example, would there be a supply chain being broken off or included in this parent group? And maybe you could address that for us, Ben. So do you see additional subgroups forming up?
Yeah, I think so. You know, within orbit, like I said, Mr. Augustus was kind enough to remind me that it was, in fact, 2 weeks ago. Time has no meaning, but I think there are basically two initiatives that are currently under it because those currently exist. I definitely see that there will be a need to um, add more as things kind of get going and potentially, parts of, other initiatives currently within OpenSSF might be better homed under Orbit. Um, so a lot of it kind of depends on who shows up with the ideas and to do the work, just like in any open source project. But I definitely see, there are groups, like there is a working group right now, at least one. There's a supply chain integrity working group. There may be other supply chain specific working groups in the OpenSSF already. So there's a lot of opportunity to, add new work or coordinate existing work within the OpenSSF.
Mhm. In a tangentially related question, our friend Munawar asks, he may have missed this and he apologizes, but do we have a roadmap for the data we need to generate and the tooling we want to have? I'll start with Ben and then I can jump in.
So, right now, I would say the baseline itself provides the data you need to generate. Some of the things in there are, pretty trivially checkable through, I say a GitHub API query to see, do you have two-factor authentication enabled, things like that. Some of them are a little squishier, that like, do you have a policy for this? Okay, well, we can say, look in this file for the policy, but like, is it a good policy or is it just we have an empty security.md so that the checks will pass? Um, that's a little harder one to evaluate, and I don't know that we'll ever get to the point of like saying, yeah, this is actually a security policy versus a checkbox. Um, but there is active work. Security Insights, that project is working to kind of help define some of the fuzzier things of like, okay, well, here's where your end of life policy lives. It's in this file, so that projects can in a more predictable way point to where some of the more documentation oriented things are. That's a problem is like, we have a lot of standards that have kind of come up as common practices for like, you have a README file uh, in the repo, you have a file that's license or copying that gives the license. Like a lot of these things have sort of standardized. A lot of the more documentation-y kind of things are just like, they're probably there somewhere, maybe on an entirely different repo, entirely different web domain. Who knows? And so, that's one of the things we are working on. And then, for the rest of the tooling, I don't know if there's a timeline, but obviously, the sooner we can put stuff in people's hands, the sooner that more people will be able to easily start evaluating their projects against the baseline.
And
And
this is
that's
where,
where I'll toss it to Krob.
yeah, I'll step in. This is where, as that new orbit working group starts to form, we have 4 proposed software projects today that want to participate as part of this baseline ecosystem. Uh, we will be working on an actual reference architecture once we get agreement from those volunteers, kind of put their efforts forward and to start to commit to do some of these things. But we'll have a reference architecture published. And our goal with this whole system is to have using open protocols, open data, open formats, so that anyone that has an alternate tool that isn't necessarily part of the working group should be able to join in and leverage and access that data at any point along the system. But if you're interested in learning more about the roadmap and the specifics of how the tooling is going to be worked out, join the Orbit Working Group. I think we have a call next week. My next question, inquiring minds from the internet would like to know, Megan, the Global Cyber Policy Working Group, what types of things is the working group thinking about delivering? That course is amazing, and we have a link that will be, it's in the chat right now, and it'll be shared after the meeting. But what other types of things are these groups thinking about working on next?
That is a great question. So, lucky enough for us, we've got people in this working group that seem to be planted across the myriad of other organizations that are also working on this exact topic, right? Because as you can imagine, many foundations are trying to get together and figure out how we can harmonize the standards that are coming out and set some best practices that will really work for projects across the globe rather than focusing on just one particular continent or region, right? So we are kind of pulling in all of that data that we can from various representatives and then figuring out what assets will best serve the community. So by way of these tech talks, right, we're going to start doing more of these, and a lot of them will be forward thinking and focusing on the CRA and actual implementation, right? And then other assets like decision trees will be coming out. Do I have a type 1 or type 2, right? We're not lawyers, so please also talk to your lawyers, talk to your consultants, but we will definitely provide some guidance from our best practices, right? And then other educational courses, like I mentioned, the blinders, right? We kind of envision doing something that's a little bit more segmented for OSPOs versus maybe the developer, right? And maybe the maintainer of the open source project. They all kind of have different levels of involvement with the CRA, and so kind of breaking those down into bite-sized courses is kind of the goal there. And then we also have got events and kind of doing blogs, right? We always are accepting community blogs as well, and then working across those tooling and standards working groups to amplify what they've got going on and share all of the tool goodness that will help this beautiful regulation just seamlessly adapt.
Thank you. So we have a longtime listener, first-time caller from the internet with a question for Emily. This is a lot. The CRA seems to be a little scary, but are you aware of other efforts, new regulations that may be lurking down the road that we may need to prepare for? And are we ready for what our preparations with the CRA? Does it help us with other things?
So for myself, I don't know of anything that's lurking behind the hedges that's going to jump out and get us anytime soon. I think CRA is enough of a problem right now for us to handle. There are a lot of good things that the CRA is actually looking to do from a best practices perspective that we as an industry just really need to get the muscle memory to start exercising more consistently and creating more of that kind of security first mindset and security first culture as we approach secure development practices instead of just general development practices. But that being said, you never know what the future holds. There's a lot of interesting tension and dynamics that are going on in the world today, and that automatically is going to result in changes forthcoming in the future. So while we may not be in territory where there is additional regulation coming beyond CRA, or perhaps there is, and I'm just not privy to it, it's totally possible. I'm not everywhere yet. I think it's important that we pay attention and be flexible and adaptable as some of these regulations start to change or as standards start to be finalized, as new specifications and frameworks be developed for adoption and testing and then implementation for consumers to be able to take advantage of. And I think that's going to be the trickiest part, is making sure that we are not over engineering solutions to a much simpler problem than we should be.
Thank you. Well said. We have another question from one of our attendees. Ninel asks, and this will be for the whole panel, is there a index that anyone's aware of that might allow somebody to measure the readiness and assess the relative strength of a project's practices, and how open are they to be able to how open is that entity to be producing and contributing and leveraging open source software? Being aware of like a good measure, like a good measuring stick to look at the qualities of upstream open source projects.
I can start. There's a lot of different tools and measures that are out there. I think at large, the first question is whether or not a project is part of a foundation or not. Different foundations have different ways of evaluating both project health and project security. But not all projects exist within foundations. There are plenty of projects that don't even exist on GitHub, and it's a bunch of friends that are just mailing code around on a mailing list, which is totally fine. However, we have not centralized it as an industry, and part of the problem is that every project is subject to its own governance within the confines if it's in a foundation or not. So they can do things their own very different way. What's acceptable for one project from a release cadence perspective may not be acceptable for another project. So we have to be mindful that we can't use the same rule of measure for all open source universally. We actually have to tailor it, and we should be focusing more specifically on the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. your risk is not the same as my risk, as we've learned through the pandemic. So it's important that you consider what it is that you're actually trying to prevent and whether or not a project under scrutiny is capable of assisting you in that particular outcome or whether or not you need to look elsewhere. So projects underneath of CNCF, we have LFX dashboard and insights, and the technical oversight committee performs due diligence. We produce those artifacts so anybody consuming or adopting our projects understand what it is that they're actually getting. Several other foundations do something very similar with varying degrees of complexity and granularity or abstraction on top of that. So it really just depends on where you're going.
Fair enough. So as I wait, we'll take one more question. I'll invite my friend Angela to come back on and talk about upcoming events and how to get involved.
Hey everyone, just wanted to give everyone a reminder that the OpenSSF Community in North America is happening on June 26th, and the schedule is now live on the event website, and any sponsorships are welcome. We're also having the Community Japan happening in June as well, and the CFP actually ends this weekend on April 27th, along with the Community India. So check those out, and we also have the Community Europe happening on August 28th, and the CFP is now open as well.
Excellent. Our next slide, if you want to click to that while we wait for one more question, is ways you could participate. There are as many different ways to participate in the OpenSSF as there are stars in the heavens. First off, you could join a working group, SIG, or project. Our community calendar is public. You can go to our website or follow that link once you get this deck, and you can figure out where all these amazing efforts are going and kind of hop on one that you're interested in. Every one of our efforts has a Slack channel, has a GitHub repository, and has mailing lists. And if you are really super excited about participating in this community, we have ways that you can become an actual official member, although there is no membership required to participate. And what is our very last slide? Oh, that's all the socials. So if anybody cares, there's a lot of different ways you can keep track and up to date with all the amazing things our community members and our projects are doing. And check us out on the socials. We would love to hear from you and engage with us. And yes, the presentation and all of the links within will be available right after this. So I want to thank my amazing community members. Oh, Ben, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw one more thing in the, promotion of participating in OpenSSF projects. You do not have to be a security expert. In fact, I think a lot of
Look
the
at me.
projects would do better with people who aren't security experts. Like I said, with Baseline, like we need actual people who are going to be using this to give us feedback on it. There's so much in any open source project that is not directly contributing to the code and the domain expertise, documentation, graphic design, things like that. So if you're at all interested, please find a project that sounds fun and join in.
Excellent. And my friend Angela wants to remind you, please take the survey and let us know how we did, how we can do better, and what future topics you're interested in seeing a tech talk on. Not seeing any additional questions, I want to thank our amazing panel. You are brilliant community members. You're helping drive security up and downstream. Thank you for your time today. And thank you to our engaged audience. Great questions. Thank you for taking time out of your day to learn about a little bit more about cybersecurity, about the open source baseline, and about our global policy efforts. So thank you.